Dreams and visions weigh heavily upon Eddie and Ellie. A betrayal comes to fruition. Containment begins to end as the nightmare breaks free. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. Eddie couldn't sleep. He'd had minor scuffles with insomnia for as long as he could remember. Even as a child, and without fail it would strike the night before the school year started, or before moving to a new home, or before a promising gig. Worse still were the nights waiting for his father to get home and discover he'd broken something, or before a difficult breakup, or, as he thought about it, there had not been any prior tough nights of anticipation and anxious nerves to quite match this one. They'd gone over the items in their father's old bag. They'd studied the generation's old book until the stale, waxy odor of its pages no longer registered to their senses. They had a plan. At least, she had a plan. And she still wanted him to come along. How that could be so, after his shameful spectacle the last time they were down there, Eddie didn't know. But his little sister wasn't little anymore in any sense that mattered, and if she believed they'd be stronger together, then he was certainly going to try. They'd talked about it in terms of a zipper. They were each half of a seam, and the family rights could bring them together or push them apart. It was up to them which way to pull. And she was right. Upward and together was better. She had even convinced him to stop sleeping on the couch and take their father's old bed. In truth, she'd offered to take it herself and give him their old bedroom, but he wanted to be strong. He wanted to carry some part of the burden, since she was resolved to take it up either way. They only had each other now, he supposed.
Ellie set her half-drunk glass of water on the bedside table, tugged the beaded cord to turn out the lamp, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would be trying, but she made up her mind. She would honor her dad's memory, not only directly by taking over the rights, but further by not falling into the same traps he had. Not the traps down below the park or even the ones he died from, but the traps of feeling defeated before even starting, of giving up, of looking at everything as an obstacle or a punishment or burden. In fact, after some reading, she and Eddie had learned that the traps in the pit shouldn't be thought of as traps at all, but as natural spirits or guardians, working together towards containment, the only priority. Working together, not unlike the halves of the zipper her and her brother had used as a metaphor for the two of them. Maybe his theater jargon and symbolism was starting to rub off on her, but anything representing pulling them back together was something she could get behind. Interlocking part of a vital purpose or not, it was difficult to think of the living flame as anything but an enemy. Ellie did her best to put aside her anger, not to mention the seared-in memory of her father's final moments. She had to avoid fixating on one facet rather than the balance. She needed a clear head if she wanted to avoid grim mistakes. Ellie cinched the blankets up around her neck, cocooning herself in a welcome and uniform warmth. Her head slowly nodded one way and then the other, and she began to float. Each direction an infinite possibility, and each breath a new lifetime. Her skin tingled, her eyes sank, her spine relaxed. She was asleep already, and dreaming. She had a hunch that there might be dreams this night. Visions, connections.
Eddie ran over and over the conversations he'd recently had. Conversations he wished had gone differently. No matter what trauma he recalled or what future he dreaded, nothing haunted him so expertly at night as the echoes of his own idiotic words. Those two in the black suits had sat there listening to him dribble like a mental patient, which technically he was. Often his therapist back in LA had to roughly assert the virtues of honesty and her absence of judgment as he flew off the handle or broke down mid-session. His manager told him to take as much time off for family bullshit, as Eddie had put it, as he needed. He managed to sound both supportive and condescending. Eddie felt he probably deserved to be talked to that way. It was curious that the suits would be there with him now, let alone his therapist and his boss. They should have been 2 time zones away, one empty and one full. But there they were, just out of earshot, talking to the pair of people in black suits. Eddie tried to remember whether the woman had been so short before or the man's hands so big. Everything felt exaggerated. What exaggerated things were they all saying to each other, Eddie wondered. The group glanced his way and laughed. His manager coughed and kept staring while the others returned to their gossip. Eddie prepared to explain that he'd come back to work soon, but the words never made it to his mouth. The man flicked his cigarette away and exhaled its final smoke cloud into Eddie's face. He was suddenly near enough to do so, with great effect. "You're never coming back here," the California man said. "You never got here to begin with," the California woman added. Eddie coughed away the vapor, not even his boss's brand, by the smell of it, and sighed. He'd overcome insomnia and fallen right into the only thing even less restful, one of his intense family madness nightmares. The suits, now completely in silhouette, said nothing, but Eddie heard what they were thinking. "You've realized that you're dreaming, but you're still powerless. You have everything you need except for the only thing that matters." Eddie had no time for riddles, or for his West Coast acquaintances, or for alleged government agents. As he turned away, his spinning became rocking. The blur of a world around him turned sideways, and he was in the long-gone hammock in his childhood backyard, reading. It was one of his sci-fi choose-your-own-adventure books. Eddie was too old for such frivolities, of course, so he was reading it straight through.
Ellie tried to move, to explore, to inquire. Her legs were still, her body was asleep, her voice was inert. This was evidently not the sort of dream she would be able to steer. Perhaps there was no import here at all. This could be a simple everybody type dream. She didn't want to think it. She tried not to think it, but in doing so, she couldn't avoid thinking it. She was dreaming, and figuratively toothless, and so it began. An all too familiar sensation filled her mouth. Her tongue poked, and a tooth gave way. It was loose enough to escape, but still had to scrape and grind its way past its neighbors in order to be spat out. Ellie felt like vomiting as the hard, wet nugget of bone passed outwards towards her lips. The nausea only made her jaw clench, which alerted her tongue to yet another target. Stop it, Ellie thought to herself, and to her tongue as it began prodding her molar. Blood seeped out from below as it rocked in its socket, and its sticky taste became unwantingly vivid as Ellie breathed in sharply through her nose. The second tooth scuffed its way out of the side of her mouth, bringing warm blood and drool with it. More teeth volunteered to torture her, each in turn rubbing and scraping and squeaking their way from craters in her gums past her lips. She counted 10, but wasn't sure, and her mouthful of gravel didn't feel the slightest bit diminished. Ellie began to acknowledge that it might never stop. Dream logic could supply her with hundreds or thousands of teeth to lose. Instead, the unwelcome clutter in her mouth became finer and sharper. Rather than wiggling loose, her teeth began to chip and crack, fragments sharp against her lips and nerves left half exposed. The pace picked up, and the nauseating flow of countless teeth by the fraction continued to fall. Soon Ellie was encircled, not by her teeth, but by shattered, twisted iron. A crack of sunlight appeared and widened, blasting color and vibrance down to her from a crooked gap far above. It hadn't dawned on her that she was free to move until the sun found its peak and its beams found her face. Ellie spat out a bloody tooth one last time.
Eddie turned a non-linear page and found himself turning 21 again. The same table at the same LA bar, but his group of friends was nowhere to be seen. The door swung open, admitting a brief burst of blinding light from the setting sun, along with him. The last person on the planet Eddie would have wanted to have a beer with that evening. Some part of him, though, then and now, desperately wished he could have. Here was his chance. He could flip his father the bird and walk out. He could ignore him completely. He could toast his coming of age with his old man like a normal human being. His father walked to the table, and Eddie stood. To hug him, or to shake his hand, or to leave. His father swung his hand and struck him, and he was a child again. Eddie was back at the awkward square table, letting all new people know he was a child. Eddie was down in the family pit, getting scolded by his big little sister for being such a child. His father swung his hand and struck him, and he was off the hook. Eddie was back at the dumb square table, and he was the only one who had any idea about the true nature of the person whose mess they were all cleaning up. Eddie was down in the ritual pit, horrified and overjoyed that he'd just watched the old failure burn and fall. His father swung his hand, and Eddie caught it. He gripped the oversized wrist in both hands, matching its strength and trembling. His flinched, squinted eyes opened. The hand before him had 6 fingers, somehow both fleshy and bony, and growing. The 6 fingers stretched, the 6 nails became claws, the wrist's fetid flesh began scabbing over Eddie's hands. This wasn't his father. This was her. The reason for all the talk of containment, the reason for all the bullshit, he had her, and she had him. Unnatural scabs spread painfully up Eddie's arms. His flesh was being turned to scale and ash, but he could not let go. He wouldn't let go. He forced his empty lungs to inhale. He knew he must continue living to continue holding her down. She had to be contained at any cost. She had escaped. His hands, frozen in space before him, curled around emptiness.
Ellie stood at the bottom of the pit. Earth, water, wind, flame, and lightning layered above in a delicate cooperative harmony. Ellie did not trust the flame, but needed it to play its part. A monstrous pile of iridescent chains heaved slowly, its prisoner breathing deeply. Thin trails of glowing blood snaked out from below the chains, forking and forging like roots in search of nutrients. Ellie watched a tiny stream flow towards her, dripping forward into a fine tendril of blood, both dark and bright, blindly approaching her toes. It felt unwise to be barefoot down here, but there was nothing Ellie could do about it. Time slowed and stopped as the blood of the contained touched the flesh of the keeper. Opposing bloodlines recoiled back through the generations long dead. The slick rainbow glow of the chains fissured. Forces within were exploding. If time were to resume flowing, the only priority would be lost. The list of enemies now included time.
Eddie dropped his empty hands. He had never been able to hold on when it mattered. He was no longer alone, but everyone around him was a stranger, frozen in stone. Some were missing limbs, some had shattered completely, and all were staring at him. Thoughts sounded from the growing darkness around him. Voices he didn't know, speaking truths he did. You don't have the strength to protect her. You don't have the wisdom to save yourself. You don't have the guts to save him. The last voice was the loudest, and came from not a person of stone, but a 2-foot-tall stuffed panda, glowing singularly in the darkness. It was protective, though of whom Eddie had no idea. He sensed that his own failure could indeed somehow doom a young boy, the friend of this speaking toy messenger. Eddie wanted to ask what the bear meant, or how he could help, or even just who or where the boy was. There must be someone who could save the child, if Eddie could not. There would be no answers. The panda spoke only one time. Silence had swallowed him already, and stone swallowed him next. The stuffed bear became another petrified figure. Finally, the darkness began to swallow all Eddie could see. The stone skin of frozen people dissolved, their lidless eyes staring at Eddie. Whether their expressions were of terror or betrayal or fury was impossible to tell. The fossilized skin, sinew, muscles, and bones vanished into nothingness in hazy, dusty patches. The bear likewise eroded into a chaos of sewn seams of rock and cotton-shaped, spongy stone. The darkness swallowed everything whole, but slowly and without organization. The faintest points of light from the stuffed animal's eyes were the final remnant of Eddie's sight to fade away.
Ellie slowly became aware of a sensation and din of static. The dull, soft noise all around her began to sound like a voice, then 2 voices, then 10, 100, and 1,000. The voices moved, spun, orbited, and their motion became music. This was a song Ellie had heard before, but now it was loud, living, and engulfing her. It was the encore of a concert on a band's farewell tour, one final time. The song would soon be over, never to be heard again. There will be others. Ellie heard a voice before she caught a glimpse of a figure. Other songs, some good, some bad. The woman speaking to her sounded maddeningly familiar, but try as she might, Ellie could not identify her. The woman circled Ellie, occasionally flitting by her peripheral vision. Was she one of the voices? Was she going to end soon as well? No questions were taken. The song began to dissipate. Ellie wasn't prepared for the music to end. She'd only just begun to appreciate it. She was so close to pinning down the melody and identifying the voice. She needed just one more moment. She nearly had it. But everything continued to fade away. Ellie decided to listen and absorb and remember it as intensely and as clearly as possible. As if triggered by her resolve, the song ended. A tear fell from her eye, a tear containing the final verse, which could now never be heard. It rolled down the scar on her cheek and fell off her body, away into oblivion.
Eddie was alone, but vague walls folded unto each other all around him, contorting into bizarre, stark shapes and slowly closing in. He knew that soon, inevitably, he would be folded up too. Newspapers, homework, playbills, any page of paper, no matter the size or thickness, could be folded no more than 7 times. Eddie wondered how many folds his page of bone and sinew and fluid and tissue could endure. He wondered what life would be like afterward. He kept away from each folding wall as long as he could, but in short order, he had nowhere left to go. Eddie braced his entire being, but was completely unprepared for how loud it was to be folded. The calamity and sheer volume would have made him jump and rush to cover his ears, but as a folded person, he could do neither. The second fold was both louder and softer, smaller but creasing him in more directions at once. By the third fold, the deafening sound had taken a back seat to both the searing pain and the snake-fuckingly crazy essence of what was happening.
Ellie heard a 4th bell ring into existence and gazed up at its vibrating form. The first bell had looked enormous, floating above her, but it sounded diminutive, like a dainty service bell. As the subsequent bells had chimed into place within the cavity of the first, like Ukrainian nesting dolls, each had curiously sounded bigger and deeper. A 5th bell tolled, with a tone low and loud enough to rattle Ellie. She was too close to all of this. She had to move. Her body refused and kept still. The 6th bell knelled around her head like a helmet, no more than an inch away, its deep waves popping her ears and ruffling her hair. It was now or never. Somewhere in the house, a clock finished striking 7. Eddie and Ellie awoke.
Eddie's neck was as sore as he could remember it ever being. He pulled his face from its awkward position beside the pillow, and the sheet tugged at the dried blood on his lip before releasing him. He tasted blood between his teeth and dabbed his chin to find it both sticky and bruised. He slumped back down into a less uncomfortable recline and stared at the ceiling. He didn't have to see or touch his right eye to recognize the feel of a dark and swollen shiner. He raised his hands and took inventory. There was blood beneath most of his nails, and the 2 snapped-off stubs throbbed. One was outlined in blood and the other covered, a grotesque true or false exam answer he'd clearly marked incorrectly. Eddie's entire body ached as he sat up. He found small clumps of his hair on either edge of the bed. His hand reflexively scanned across his scalp and discovered scattered bald spots, more bruises, and the early phase of a long scab. According to his sweaty body odor and his shivering, he needed a hot shower. Lifting his legs incited a few more dried blood grabs from the bedding. Eddie shuffled to the bathroom, opened the shower valves, and decided not to check the mirror until after cleaning up. After stripping down, he was about to slip in behind the shower curtain when he changed his mind. He needed to be strong and willing to see the truth no matter what. Eddie considered putting his pajamas back on and checking on Ellie before showering. She'd probably had nightmares too. He could sense that she was shaken, but calming herself and otherwise all right. Perhaps they were zipping together and getting stronger already. He couldn't remember the last time he'd reached out to her in that way. Still, looking at the beaten-up husk of himself in the mirror, he chose to spare her that particular visual.
Ellie half smiled that Eddie checked on her emotions by thought. They had often done things like that as children, but as Eddie grew up, he shut down that part of himself. Perhaps his metaphorical closeness zipper was ironically opening him up. She had to remember that one. It would get an eye roll for sure. And it was just as well he hadn't come to see how she was doing in person. She sat up from lying just as she had been when she had gone to bed. The last thing her muscles remembered doing was turning out the light. After feeling paralyzed all night, and even several minutes after waking up, Ellie's body had evidently been much busier than she expected. She kicked off her socks, which was normal, but she also fussed her way out of her pajama bottoms, her nightshirt, and her panties. The pillows, the blankets, the fitted sheet, everything except herself that had been on the bed when she had fallen asleep was now strewn all over the floor. She heard the shower running, got up from the bare bed, and looked to clothe her bare self before putting the bed back together and running a brush through her hair. Eddie had probably dreamed too, and to hear him tell it, his dreams were not to be envied.
Brother and sister met in the kitchen. The aroma from a brewing pot of coffee almost made the cluttered room feel like home again.
Eddie picked apart an orange, and Ellie toasted a pair of frozen waffles.
We overslept,
they heard each other think.
After a fleeting moment of eye contact, they returned to their food.
Ellie didn't ask about the black eye, or why he was wearing a hoodie, or any of the other dozen questions anyone would ask somebody looking the way Eddie did. She felt pangs of guilt for having yelled at him after Dad had died. Granted, he had been handling it terribly, but clearly, something about all this was way more rough on him than it was on her.
Eddie flinched each time citrus juices found their way into the cuts and sores on his fingers. He hadn't thought through his choice of breakfast very well, but there was no sense in giving up halfway through. He was sure he'd need the energy. When the plates and cups were empty, there were no more excuses for silence. If they were going to be a team, they needed to compare notes on their dreams. They'd explicitly discussed that very point as some sticky but important teeth in their zipper.
Ellie thought it might help to talk about the ending first. Containment is failing, isn't it? She said.
Eddie nodded thoughtfully. She could get out. If that happens, Eddie started. Neither knew how to finish that thought. Somewhere in the house, the intrepid buried clock struck. One more time. Hi, it's me. It's happening.
Friedman, I was afraid you forgot all about me. Are you sure this time?
Pretty sure. I think we have to assume 17 has its body. We know Tupperware's dead. The next gen hasn't been there, and yeah, all the underground sensors are going nuts.
Then it's time to save the day, isn't it?
I know, but the commander must have a contingency plan, right? I just think maybe we should wait and...
You are the commander now. You always have been. We can't afford to wait and react. Last time, it wasn't even together, and you remember what happened when it made the first move.
Yeah, I remember.
Plus, Mira, are you joking? She doesn't have it in her to deal with this thing head on.
Well, that's just it. She already has once.
Don't doubt yourself now. You were in charge for a reason.
And now she's in charge for a reason.
You said it yourself. 17 has its body now. That never happened under your watch.
No, that's true. Wait, that was the other thing. She said someone from Alpha killed you. She said she saw it herself.
Do I sound dead to you?
You know what I mean. What happened?
She saw what she saw. She's not the Girl Scout you think, but she didn't lie to you either.
How could neither of you be lying to me?
Let's just say I had a contingency plan of my own.
Fine. Look, you said to tell you if and when containment failed. As for the rest of it...
Don't lose confidence now. Look, you tried to quit, right?
Yes, and it went just like you said. She wouldn't let me. But I'm not so sure it follows that her methods are wrong.
Maybe not. Maybe so. The point is she's using you again. She knows as well as anybody that you should be the one calling the shots.
Let's say you're right. This whole coup thing just feels... Why not go to Alpha directly?
Alpha. They drank the same Kool-Aid as Mira. We're on our own now. You're going to have to do what's right.
It's just... I thought that's what I was doing before, and people were killed.
What's important is you learn from it, right? By making the first move, you can avoid that from happening again.
I know, it's just...
Look at it this way. You know who's with you. Sounds like most of them, right? And when you send the order, you'll find out right away if they're serious.
That's true.
If you have enough support, and you will, then you can make this happen. You do that, and you'll get results.
And that's what matters. The chain of command, the bureaucrats at Alpha, you're right. All pretty much nothing compared to taking out 17.
Damn straight. So, do you have it ready?
The order? Yeah, it's ready. It'll pass authentication. Looks like it came right from the top.
Then I believe this is your moment, Commander.
It'll be good to see you again, Agent Crispin. Sarah did not like driving in the rain. It made her feel cold, wet, and hollow. The air had a heavy dankness to it. The feeling reminded her of the basement she had lived in while she was in college at River Falls. She could never warm up in that windowless cube beneath the earth. Her landlady was going through menopause, so she would keep the thermostat either off or at 64. This often made the downstairs bedroom she rented beyond frigid. It was early morning. School buses had not yet started filling the streets with their ambling yellow shells. It was mostly delivery trucks on the roads, along with the veteran rush hour drivers, who would often dodge around Sarah in the right lane as she drove west on 694. She was not an aggressive driver. The streaks of water sizzling upwards from passing cars were almost like insults or yells from imaginary spectators mocking her overtly cautious foot on the pedal. Sarah was driving to meet a client in New Brighton. This would be her second lesson with him. She was a writing tutor, and this was her first appointment of the day. Her student, who was named Max, was the product of a trophy wife stewardess who had married an older pilot. Sarah was short, pale, with a high voice, thick glasses, sandy blonde hair, and a narrow face that was rarely ever visited by a smile. She did not forcefully stop herself from being happy, but she found it distracting while tutoring. Every day it was the same thing. Check the phone for messages of where she was going for the day and then travel there. At night, she would get home to her apartment, make dinner, watch a rerun of The Simpsons, read a few Goosebumps books for the millionth time, and go to bed. Her few friends told her to read something different, but she always declined. The books were endlessly predictable, and she needed that security. When she entered New Brighton, the ache of the windshield wiper blades began giving her anxiety. The rhythmic pattern of their dragging seemed off, like something was disrupting the normal beat to their mechanical repetition. She had recently bought this silver Chevy Malibu, so she did not think there was anything wrong with it specifically. Max lived just a few blocks off Silver Lake Road, behind a park called Hidden Oaks. She was early for his appointment, so she had the time to stop and crack open Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes. As she approached Hidden Oaks, the rain intensified from a mindless plopping to a thrashing downpour. The cascade of water was deafening, drowning out the radio, which was playing Intergalactic by the Beastie Boys. Sarah was starting to panic. Her chest hitched as she took in quick, shallow breaths. Sarah had noticed a few generic warning signs before turning onto the street with the park. It would not have made sense to have them up about the weather. It was not like they could predict it that well. She stopped her car and pulled over to what she thought was the curb. The deluge continued, to the point that she could not see out of any of her vehicle's windows. She was surrounded by water in every sense of the word. Strangely, she felt like she was being watched. It felt like someone was in the car with her, sitting behind her. The howl of raindrops turned into a roar, and a sinking feeling made the seats and steering wheel feel like they were falling all around her. Water started to pour in through the vents and other crevices throughout the interior. Sarah turned to the window and pounded against it like someone should see her. Even if there had been someone, they wouldn't have been able to see her. The rainstorm outside her door had been replaced by a clear, omnipresent wall of fluid. Her car was completely submerged, like a toy you would put in an aquarium for decoration. "Help! Someone help me!" she said, as water pooled at her feet. It was grimy and oily, picking up chemicals meant to stay locked within the vehicle's components. She honked the horn, which was nothing more than a wounded grumble in the depths. The sound of the storm was completely gone now. The only sound was a trickle of water down near her feet. There was a growl outside the windshield. Sarah could see further into the pool around her. Giant fish covered with round, concrete-colored scales were trudging by her in quizzical swims. They were as large as a truck, bug-eyed, with a cluster of ivory teeth dangling out of their narrow mouth like a bony patch of icicles. There was a shift in force beneath Sarah's feet. She felt the vehicle rising out of the water in a quick ascent, popping her ears and making her feel like she was falling. She was traveling through some sort of aquatic tunnel. All around her were stone structures. They looked like castles or forts, but they were shattered, crumbled, and decayed. She emerged onto an empty road in a wet crunch. The rain was gone. The sun was out. The sky was clear. Water stopped flowing out around her waist and feet. The air was mildewed and damp. Sarah felt trapped and sick. She tore open the car door and fell to her knees. Sarah was not in Hidden Oaks anymore. She was on top of an enormous puddle. It was as though a molten shard of the sky had settled beneath the tires and bumper of her car, which were still dripping wet. All around her were wide open plains of prairie grass, being tickled by the wind in long waves. They looked like bits of jeweled straw. There was nothing but a 2-lane road stretching in each direction, a single asphalt line marking the start and end of each opposite horizon. Other than the moisture on her, the car, and the road where she had appeared, the air was dry and unblemished by vapor. The rain was gone. But so was everything else. Sarah tried not to panic. She had a cellular phone, a Nokia 3210 that her father had bought her for emergencies. She pulled it out quickly from her red backpack, which had been high enough on the seat next to her to spare it from being soaked. She could not call the police or her dad. How would she explain it to them? She needed a moment. There was one little bar of reception wherever she had ended up. It sat like a little pixelated prayer in the corner of her phone. She decided to tell the only person who might be affected by her unexplainable absence. "Hello?" Leslie answered. Leslie was standing in her small entryway with yellow walls and gray ceramic tile. She was tall, pale, with long blonde hair, green eyes, and long legs that she liked to show off with small shorts. She had learned how to use her looks with a sort of sexual precision, but now that she was a stay-at-home mom raising 2 kids, she had fewer opportunities for using it. She did not mind having that ability. It was how she'd attracted her husband, after all. He was a veteran pilot with an aversion to settling down, even by his profession's standards. "I'm sorry, Sarah, I can't make out what you're saying. I assume you're canceling today?" Leslie said into her white, cordless phone. A dog barked in the background. A child screamed. Shut up, I'm on the phone, she snapped. Her kids laughed down the hall from her in the living room with white carpet and a black leather couch. They were watching Beast Wars, Transformers, and throwing Legos at each other. Okay, Sarah, I can't hear anything you're saying, so I'm going to hang up. We'll see you next week, she said. She pushed hard on the center white button to turn off the phone. It had been worn out from use and stuck down easily. She turned around to bring it back to the holster hanging by the fridge in the kitchen. She saw something odd from the back left corner of her eye. A person went running by her at a nearly full run. They were moving too quickly for her to observe any real details. They were a gray blur, soundlessly moving across the pavement. Another followed, and another. Leslie stepped outside her front door. Her lawn was a wedge of olive green, divided by a black rectangle of a driveway. At the end of it was a white mailbox with some flowers sprouted beneath it. The weather had been rainy most of the morning, but it seemed to have ended even though a staunch, opaque layer of clouds remained. Leslie focused on the suburban road with a squint, searching for more of the shapes dashing by. Nothing. She itched her nose and adjusted her hair. She started to close the door when a few more floated by. She was quick enough to follow their trails this time. They went to her right, down the block and rounded the corner towards Hidden Oaks Park. They were tall, wide, and walking like people, but they seemed to lack every other physical trait. Their composition was hollow, invisible except for random billows of captured gloom. They reminded her of her own shadow, a realization that made her skin panic somewhat, unfurling itself in a constellation of goosebumps down her arms. "I'll be right back, guys. I need to check something outside," she shouted to her children. She did not wait for a reply. As she gave chase to the strange figures, a subtle fear started to fill her body. She felt numb, distant, like it was hard to know if she was in control of her own body. Why was she doing this? She felt compelled to run along with them, to become another one of the people rushing past. How could that be possible? She had never felt urges like this before. She had to follow them. She had to track them. Leslie was not far away from where the last penumbra raced around the end of the street, turning toward the park. She was barefoot, occasionally stepping upon little kernels of rock spiking through the tops of puddles. It hurt, but she didn't care. A few cars passed by as she walked, slowing down slightly as they noticed her trance-like state. She felt pressured to sprint. She curved around the four-way stop just outside of Hidden Oaks and reached 29th Avenue. Across the street from the woods, small parking lot, and tennis court, a mob of these silhouettes had formed. Their arrangement made them appear as though they were a streak of obsidian dust that had fallen out of some dark nebula and risen in pillars to impersonate human contours. Despite being so abstractly built, if she looked hard enough, she could see chins, cheeks, and other features adorning the mystical onlookers. She followed their stares to the forest as if it held the answer. It looked normal, empty, a wall of foliage still dripping from the morning storm. The crowd was transfixed, like they were spectators in some ancient coliseum waiting for a gladiator to strike a killing blow. "What are you all looking at?" Leslie finally said. There was silence from the mob. "Hello? What are you all looking at?" "Excuse me, who are you talking to?" a woman suddenly said from behind her, breaking the spell. Leslie whirled around. A short black woman with curled hair in a blue leisure suit was walking a charcoal-colored miniature dachshund right behind her. "What do you mean?" Leslie said. It felt strange to speak. There was numbness, as though she was learning how to use her throat and tongue again. "Who were you talking to, ma'am?" the woman said. Leslie turned back to the host of shadows she had been following. They were all gone. Every single one. She felt a profound loneliness, like she was a child in gym class being picked last for a team. It had been years since she had felt this way. She started to cry uncontrollably. "I guess they were right saying to stay out of the park with the fungus and such. Are you okay, dear?" Leslie suddenly realized she had left her kids at home alone. "I got to go," she said, walking away. The woman watched as Leslie briskly waddled home. She took a deep breath. The air smelled of wet grass and petrichor. Her name was Lorna. She had been living in the neighborhood for 20 years. She had been a sales rep for a medical equipment distributor in Fridley. She had recently retired and enjoyed walking her miniature dachshund Leo around the neighborhood, but had been avoiding the park because of the warnings in the news. This was the closest she had gotten to Hidden Oaks lately, and observing this strange woman's behavior only validated her caution. She stared at the trees the woman had been so hypnotized by. Nothing unusual. They were glowing a bit against the backdrop of a cloudy sky. "I don't get it, Sir Leo. Let's head home," she said, pulling on the neon pink leash attached to her dog. Leo woofed and turned, but suddenly froze and urinated on the pavement. His body was shaking. He immediately sat down on his belly. Leo, what's going on with you?" Lorna said, gently pulling on the leash. The dog would not move. She bent down to pick him up. He was trembling so violently that Lorna could feel the looser spots of her stocky frame jiggling by proxy. "What's gotten into you, Sir Leo?" Then Lorna noticed the air around her. The atmosphere had slowly turned green, dark, and potentially violent. "Wow, did weather turn quick? Let's get home," Lorna said, jogging in the direction of her house a few blocks away. A hammering sound of bone on metal slammed the turbulent air. It was metallic, deep, and piercing the ground beneath Lorna's feet. It struck. Leo howled. It struck. Lorna screamed and fell backwards onto her butt, cradling Leo, afraid to stand up. It struck. Trees, winds, even raindrops suspended themselves. It struck. The sky loosened free. A mass of green clouds started to swivel like a blustery stew above the park. It struck. Lightning began to scar the dingy clouds in barbed purple lines. It struck. Wind ruptured into an unbound squall, ramming trash cans, mailboxes, branches, leaves, and anything else not anchored to the ground. A child's red tricycle lifted over them effortlessly. Debris went airborne, being vacuumed by some unseen coercion towards the forest across from Hidden Oaks. It struck. Lorna could not think. She clutched Leo even tighter, who scrambled to breathe in the maelstrom through his nose. Oxygen was not being agreeable. They could not live in this indiscriminate void for very long. It felt like whatever was manufacturing this sound was slugging the very molten core of the earth. Then the sound was gone. The frightening sky remained, but the air settled. Lightning bolts still raged, but they were infrequent and muted. Lorna stood up. She scrambled to get home safely. She only walked a few yards when the world exploded behind her. The sound knocked her to her knees. The burst was a mixture of clanking metal, crunching road, and trickles of tiny debris drizzling everywhere. Her instinct took over to flee. She scampered up, staggered a little bit, and started to run. The detonation had shattered nearby windows and caused car alarms to blare wildly in electronic screams. The air stunk of dust and rock. Lorna could taste it invading her sinuses. Her ears were wobbled by the destruction, unwilling to function completely. Her back stung in various spots. Fragments of the road had shredded her skin. After a few seconds of running, Lorna looked back at what had nearly ended her life and Leo's. A powdery cloud hovered over a wide 10-foot crater. Inside the hole was a tangle of what looked like rope. Lorna squinted. Move, she whispered to the fog. A gust of wind improved the clarity to reveal a mass of large chains. Their size and shape reminded her of a trip to Duluth, where she had walked along a dock and stared at those coils of metal that kept the boats moored. These, however, had a strange hue to them. They sparked different tones, alternating between blue, red, green, and black like earthbound stars. The chain looked alive, moving like it had a soul or several. There were a variety of etchings carved onto the links of chain. They covered every inch of it like scales. Where did you come from? Lorna wondered. The clump of chains stirred suddenly and spread out like an iron centipede, using the ends of its tangled clumps as legs. It crawled out of the concrete dent towards the forest. It went a few feet, trembled, then collapsed again. The phosphorescence that had mesmerized Lorna earlier vanished. The chains steadily grew dull and lifeless. She felt sorry for them. She did not know why. "What were you holding?" Lorna asked them, before they went completely still. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dunn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The stories Zipper and Double Agency, written by Owen Swerkstrom. Chains by Patrick W. Marsh. The voice of Hidden Oaks, Eddie, and Agent Friedman, performed by Robert Dunn. The voice of Ellie, performed by Robin Sand. The voice of Agent Crispin, performed by Philip Iliff. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Dunn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening, and until next time.